Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nigel Inkster, the Director of Future Conflict and Cyber Security here at the Institute, and my pleasure to chair this event. Here at IISS, we get a pretty solid throughput of what one might term established names in the academic community, people who've published a lot, written a lot. But one of our functions, as I've always seen it, is to provide a springboard for emerging talent, and that is very much what we are bringing to you today in the form of Samantha Hoffman and Peter Mattis. Samantha, independent China analyst, but also a close collaborator for myself and for the Defence and Military Analysis team here at IISS, where she patiently and religiously fillets Chinese language media for relevant material. We still get to swallow the buckets of sawdust, as the great late Simon Leys put it, but it makes it so much easier that Sam tells us which buckets of sawdust we need to swallow. She's in her final year as a PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham, and she's published in a number of prestigious publications: China File, War on the Rocks, National Interest, China Brief, Forbes, and Jane's Intelligence Review. Our other speaker, Peter Mattis, a fellow at the Jamestown Foundation's China program, and if you're looking for a good source of updates on what's happening in China, I can do no better than recommend Jamestown's China Brief. It really is good. And Peter, has worked as an analyst for the U.S. government, and also for the National Bureau of Asian Research. He's written again also in a range of publications: Studies in Intelligence, International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, National Interest, Jane's, and so on. The topic today is to do with the establishment now 4 years ago of a new Central State Security Commission, which when it first appeared was presumed by many foreign observers to be a kind of equivalent of the United States National Security Council. But the point that many of these observers missed was that actually the primary driver for the creation of this new body was a reflection of what has always been the top priority for China's leadership, which is internal security and the management of social stability. It may intermittently serve as something akin to a National Security Council, but that is not its primary purpose. So I'm going to turn to our two speakers to explain to us exactly what purpose this organisation does serve and what have been the drivers for its creation. The whole thing, both presentation and the ensuing Q&A, will be on the record. and our speakers will leave adequate time for a Q&A. I forgot to ask which of you is going to go first. Peter's going to go first. All right, okay, so Peter, without any further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, like Michael's, well, first, thank you very much for hosting us today, Michael. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially because Sam and I started looking at this in 2012, and I'd written a piece about some critiques coming out of Central Party School. More information was coming out, and I asked Sam to take a look and see what was going on with the discussion of social management. And then a year later, when this was announced at the third plenum, we had a lot of background sort of ready to go that no one else had really looked at. And the first point is, why should we call this the State Security Committee? Because we are actually a bit different than the rest of the China watching community to refer to it that way. And the official translation is the National Security Commission. Our main point is simply that when you say national security in English, it gives a sense of what our Ministry of Defense or the Department of Defense in the United States performs. It's an external mission primarily. Occasionally there's something internal where reserves are called up or some other thing, but it's primarily external facing. And state security, for those of us who have worked in a Soviet context, also has a very specific meaning that starts from the inside and goes outward. It's not from the outside in. We called it the KGB was the Committee for State Security, not the Committee for National Security. And when this was announced, it was really one line in a plenum work report. And one of my former colleagues in the government was quoted in the New York Times as simply saying, "This is a big deal." But that was kind of the extent of what was out there. There was very little evidence that you could rely on and put your hooks into and try to extract good information from. So at the time, sort of three competing stories, if you will, emerged about what the Central State Security Committee was and what it was intended to do. And it's not so much the description of the State Security Committee was different. It's that the story behind it, why did it come to be, what was it intended to, what were the problems that it was intended to resolve, are in fact very, very different and have very different implications for how you understand the Chinese system and the Chinese Communist Party. The first story, which could be mostly associated with Mike Lampton at SAIS, Joel Withnow now with National Defense University, and Hu Weixing at Hong Kong University, is that yes, political security is an important piece of the purpose of the State Security Committee, protecting the party's power, but it's from the outside in. It's because of the external environment and the inability of the PRC apparatus, so party state apparatus, to make good decisions on foreign policy, have an integrated approach. It's the institutional inadequacies that made this a problem. The other major driver for this was the idea that China wants to practice some kind of great power diplomacy, something to be more active, as opposed to Deng Xiaoping's Taogong Yanghui, sort of a passive role, biding one's time, and preparing to act when it was sort of more propitious. They look at it as being inspired by Jiang Zemin's visit to the National Security Council, or really the executive staff building connected to the White House in 1997, and the idea that you had a staff of professionals drawn from across the government in a variety of experiences dealing with a common set of issues and being able to reach out across the departments. And the events driving this sort of first version of it are the EP3 incident in 2001, for example, where you have the Chinese plane hitting the U.S. biplane, which sort of made an emergency landing on Hainan, and the crew was detained. And there was a lot of trouble in the PRC system, even within it, much less the U.S.'s interactions with that system, of finding out what was going on, who knew what, who had whom in this particular case. And some of the stories that have come out, for example, about the intelligence apparatus in the PLA, was that Jiang Zemin had to use his connection there to spy on the PLA, to get the truth of what was taking place. And he was getting it faster because he was relying on military intelligence than the PLA generals at the Central Military Commission. The second story primarily comes from Yoji, which again is political and regime security is paramount. The NSC mission, or the State Security Commission's mission, is much broader than strictly national defense. And he was very explicit in recognizing that this was a broader issue set than sort of a purely external defense or management of foreign policy. His story was that it was driven by institutional inadequacy. It's that the national security leading small group or the foreign affairs leading small group could not actually make real decisions, but they sort of compiled a set of options that went to the Politburo Standing Committee before action was taken. And one of the points that is there in the party documents at the time was that the State Security Commission should have the ability to make decisions, that it shouldn't simply be a preparation of options that goes to the Politburo Standing Committee. The problem with it is that the story that Yoji tells, sort of leading from 1997 and Jiang Zemin's visit to the NSC up to the present, is to say, well, this is largely about Jiang Zemin's tasking to the PLA in 1998 or 1999, specifically to a princeling named Chen Zhiya, who ran the China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies, to look into crisis management mechanisms and how China could do better. When they established the National Security Leading Small Group in 2000, there was the issue of the Politburo Standing Committee not wanting to give authority over to a lower body. But there was the other issue that the PLA was unwilling to give any authority outside the Central Military Commission. They could play a sort of technical role, as they did on the Foreign Affairs Leading Small Group, providing intelligence, some sense of operational command, but any decisions involving the PLA had to come through the proper channels in the Central Military Commission. And so it meant that it was bifurcated. And you can look at sort of the U.S. PLA watching literature, and you can see some of the work that Carnegie Endowment in particular did. And these were, in fact, driven by U.S. and Chinese interactions in trying to discuss crisis management. And so this is where Yoji's story is that this is the PLA trying to do this better. Not necessarily for the government, not necessarily for support, but the PLA is the central locus of where these decisions are coming from. Our story, which is the third, is that political and regime stability, of course, is paramount.
Sorry, Peter, slightly louder.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that political security is paramount, but that it comes from the inside out. It starts internally, and the management of society and dissent, and the channels that an external actor might take advantage of, and it steadily extends outward from the internal setting. And you can find all sorts of ways in which this takes place, some of which Sam is much better suited to cover, and she is going to cover it. But the idea here for us is that the management of society is greater than security. It's not about an institutional issue. It's about the management of society and the management of the party, and the ability of the party to govern has to take precedence over security. And the story that we tell, which we'll get into, is that the core issue here for that's driving the creation of the Central State Security Commission is power, and the creation of alternative power, or sort of new forms of power, that had to be brought under the central control, because under the collective leadership of the Hu Jintao era, and Politburo Standing Committee members were essentially equals, and they couldn't really tell one of their peers how to manage the system underneath them. And this was really the first time that you had a quite vast apparatus that was commanded by a single Politburo Standing Committee member, Zhou Yongkang, that gave someone at that level so much power and authority that they hadn't been that it wasn't subservient to the senior-most political leader. So if you think back to the purges of the Mao era and all of the horrible things that happened, Kang Sheng, Wang Dongxing, Luo Ruiqing, all of these people were reporting up to the top. They weren't at the top themselves. They were subservient and subordinate. So those are sort of the three competing stories. The challenge here is that the evidence is in fact incredibly small. The level of authoritative evidence that you can say this is government policy without any doubt. It's not a debatable point. And we don't need to belabor what China specialists do over to determine authoritativeness, but basically if it comes from the center and it's coordinated, you can generally say that this is what policy is and where it's going. So the first piece of evidence is the third plenary communique, which literally has one line that says, we will establish a central state security commission to improve the state security system and state security strategy in order to protect state security. Pretty vague, meaningless phrase. The only thing that you can really take from that is that it comes under the heading of social management. In addition to this massive report and decision that came forward in the communique, there was also an explanation issued by Xi Jinping personally. And that this Central State Security Commission should deal with external security threats to sovereignty, to traditional security interests, and developmental interests. Internally, it should protect political security and preserve social stability. The third piece of evidence is that Xi Jinping gave a speech on holistic state security, under which he listed 11 areas of security, only one of which was military, and the others included information security, scientific security, cultural security, ideological security,
environmental.
So it's quite a long list of things that have internal and external elements, but again, these start from inside China and go outward. The fourth piece of evidence that you can say is there is that as the State Security Commission has been stood up, a series of working groups have appeared, and you can find them sort of by trying to track notices at municipal government levels or saying that there's a meeting taking place of some particular commission or committee. And there's definitely a counter-espionage working group, and at least some of the 11 security areas have their own sort of working group under the Central State Security Commission. So the question is, how do you deal with so little authoritative evidence? Because that's basically what is there. And you're dealing with Chinese euphemisms, and frankly, there are two ways to deal with communist euphemisms. One is to ignore them and tell the story that you'd like to tell, which is what we'd like to say that some people do. Or you can actually try to understand what social management means. And I think Sam is probably the best equipped person that I know to explain that.
So to follow on Peter's comments, in order to attempt to understand the party's language, we really need to first understand the context of that language. And the context of the key sources on state security is social management and social governance, a very related concept. And these concepts are best defined as a process. They're a process for how the party leadership interacts with the party masses and general society. The process involves shaping, managing, and responding, and it's ultimately aimed at ensuring the PRC's systemic stability and political legitimacy. It's seen that in order for the party leadership to build a dependable system, the government must always revisit the requirements of, first, ensuring that the party masses, including the security forces, are in fact serving the party leadership, and second, ensuring that the relationship between the party and the masses remains stable enough so that all sources of real and potential conflict do not reach a point of instability beyond the party's control. So state security is as much about ensuring that all members of society, party and non-party, including the security forces, can reliably step in and defend the party in a time of crisis. And in order for this to happen, the party must preemptively manage crisis. to have better control over a situation it cannot truly predict. Because in the worst case scenario, the party only needs one major crisis, one major failure for the entire Communist Party-led state to collapse. And nobody knows what that would be. The state security concept, the usage of the term state security, I've tracked PLA daily articles going back to the 1950s and looked at the usage of the term. And prior to the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, state security was really what we would think the definition would be if you're talking about national security, and most of the time it was referring to the U.S. National Security Commission. But then immediately after 1989, there's a sudden surge in literature that looks at ideology and loyalty to the party as being part of state security. So before 1989, maybe 8.6% of the literature looked at this aspect, and immediately in the 5 years after, 50% did. So ideology and party loyalty has something to do with state security. And this really contradicts a consensus among a lot of PLA observers that since the reform era began, the importance of ideology has diminished or has been referred to simply out of duty. But that assumption is really flawed. And so there's three clear themes within the concept of state security. The first is the internal security objective of ensuring order among the masses, the non-party members. The second is traditional external security. And the third is the most volatile, and that's ensuring that the party masses, the security forces that are meant to protect the party, are loyal and compliant with the party's core, the leadership. And as Peter said, there's 11 types of security included in Xi Jinping's definition of state security. This isn't really a new thing. It dates back to the early 1990s, where you start to see discussion of state security being a combination of internal and external security, of traditional and non-traditional security concerns. But I've broken down the definitions of each of these different types of securities and looked for where they were used in writing to see what they might actually mean. And the first is scientific security. A lot of people have looked at this and translated as science and technology security. However, after looking at examples of usages of the phrase, it's actually more strongly related to the Leninist concept of scientific. And I'll quote Peter here, who I think described the Leninist definition best. History is governed by objective scientific law. The party's goal is to interpret those trends of history and uncover those trends. Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought gives the party unique access to those laws. The end state is known, how to get there is not. Mistakes, therefore, are the result of flawed analysis. And this is really apparent when you read articles talking about scientific security. The use of scientific in these articles implies that scientific security has a dual meaning. It is about devising, on one end, the science and technology strong enough for prevention and response, particularly in terms of accidents and disasters. It also implicitly absolves the party leadership for blame of any mistakes made in the application of those laws. Most uses of the phrase are in articles linked to major public health and safety accidents or disasters, which created social instability and risk, particularly in the early 2000s. You've got the Sichuan earthquake in 2008, milk, baby formula poisoning and things like that. It's normally where you see this term used. And in these cases, the central government deflected blame, and failures in prevention and response were the fault of local leaders who failed to implement a scientific security standard, both literally and in terms of the Leninist definition. Therefore, the tangible objective is to build an effective mitigation and response system, but also to build in protection for the party as well. And to break down the definition of another one of the 11 securities within state security, military security, because that one is the most obvious with the external security connotation. And military security is about safeguarding national sovereignty, territorial integrity, resisting foreign aggression, carrying out the necessary modernization tasks for ensuring these objectives. The concept is also more nuanced because even the idea of sovereignty isn't just the idea of the protection of physical territory, it's also about the protection of ideas, the party's ideas. And military security is inclusive of safeguarding national unity and ensuring party loyalty and ideological unity among the armed forces. And it's about ensuring that the military participates in the political and social crisis prevention and response tasks. So, Peter and I noticed a change in what was being said in Chinese media around 2012, summer of 2012. And it's important to note that what we saw wasn't necessarily completely new, because some of what we started to see began around the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. But a much more coherent story appeared around 2012 before the leadership transition. And what shifted going into leadership transition was apparent in a series of articles, summer 2012, published by the Central Party School, which at the time Xi Jinping was the head of, arguing strongly that social management had been overly securitized. And these articles appeared in leading publications published by the Study Times, Red Flag, Seeking Truth, and implied that coercive police aspects of social management implemented under Zhou Yongkang had overtaken the softer sides, such as official performance and propaganda efforts. What led to this? There were several crisis scenarios starting with 1989. If we think about when martial law was implemented during the Tiananmen protests, it was the 20th of May, 1989. The crackdown took place on June 4th. In between, we know that Deng Xiaoping had to convince his generals to implement martial law. And immediately after Tiananmen, the focus of the PLA Daily, where articles on state security mentioned state security, was a good thing the military stepped up this time. Hopefully they do next time. It's basically the argument. Moving forward to the Kosovo War, 1998-99, and the bombing of the Chinese embassy in 99 in Belgrade. This is a war where China saw U.S. engagement in Yugoslavia was involving the protection of a secessionist force within a UN member state, where the UN did not sanction involvement, and armed conflict was conducted on humanitarian grounds. That's a threat if you're China. At the same time, the Falun Gong movement was ongoing in China, and the clearest threat in this case was that not that Falun Gong were peaceful activists staging a sit-in, but that they mobilized. Falun Gong seemingly spontaneously organized this massive demonstration. Up to thousands of party members were involved in Falun Gong, maybe even hundreds of thousands. And they included members of the state security apparatus, the PLA and the Ministry of State Security, at the highest levels as well. Next, the SARS outbreak. The military, then still under the leadership of Jiang Zemin, the Central Military Commission, but with President Hu Jintao, hid the SARS outbreak in military hospitals. And the last major crisis, the color revolutions in the early 2000s, China focused on U.S. support to varying degrees. U.S. did offer rhetorical support. U.S. groups like the National Democratic Institute promoted democracy. Activists provided training and workshops. Lots of times the extent of this is either underestimated or overestimated, but it did happen. And these are all threats, state security threats that China has to handle. And you see in each of the elements of state security: internal security in terms of social stability, external security, and ensuring internal security in terms of the party masses particularly the PLA, or the security forces, stepping up for the party at a time of crisis. And from here, I'll leave it to Peter to discuss politics and power.
So, and the question, where did you get to this point in 2012 that they say, security is driving the way they manage society? And how did this apparatus get out of control, given that, with a few exceptions in CCP history going back to 1927, when they first created an internal security apparatus and intelligence services, there have only been a few exceptional periods where they had the kind of political authority and purging ability that we think of as associated with, say, the NKVD and parts of the KGB. That they were mostly kept under very, very tight control. And at the beginning of the reform era, Deng Xiaoping had in fact taken what was left of that security apparatus out of the party and put it under the Ministry of State Security. The whole point of this being to take any sort of ideological or sort of thought crime type issues and say that those were no longer the bounds of the security service. The party could deal with that on its own internally as a matter of debate, discussion, or, if necessary, party discipline. But if it was counter-espionage, and these were things that were based on concrete acts that people had to do, and that way he could sort of sideline the security service and keep them focused on society and out of party affairs. So what happened? Well, you can't separate this from the rise of Zhou Yongkang in the security apparatus. In 2002, he, going into the 15th Party Congress, he was the Sichuan Party Secretary. And as a provincial secretary and as someone who had run previous SOEs, he was bumped up to the Politburo in 2002. In 2003, at the National People's Congress, he was officially given authority as the Minister of Public Security. Now, this is the first time in quite some time that a minister of a state organization has been at the Politburo level. And the real implication of this simply is that organizations of similar protocol rank can't give each other orders. So at the Politburo level, he was above the Ministry of State Security. He was above anyone else in the political legal apparatus, with the exception of his boss, Luo Gan. In 2007, Zhou Yongkang became the head of the Central Political Legal Commission and a Politburo Standing Committee member. I think this is the first time in CCP history where the head of the Central Political Legal Commission was a standing committee member without other portfolios or without a sort of very clear tie to a leader who was in fact above the Politburo Standing Committee. So there are two developments that created power under Zhou Yongkang. The first relates to Falun Gong and the effort to extricate what the CCP believed was quite possibly as many as 2 or 3 million members within the party. And they created the 610 office on June 10th, 1999. And this was an extrajudicial authority. And it was sort of reversing what Deng Xiaoping had done in terms of taking all of this investigative power from within the party and moving it to the state. It now created something under the party, and it started pulling everyone across the state into this policy system. It included the People's Armed Police, it included the PLA, it included the Ministry of State Security, it included the Ministry of Public Security, and it included the Procuratoriate, the investigation and prosecution legal apparatus. This was a massive interagency system that is sort of characteristic only of what might be called mature policy systems in the CCP. So when you look at foreign affairs, there are so many issues that sort of could possibly plug in at the very top, the foreign affairs leading small group, or things. The issues that would come to it are very broad. How you handle the United States is very different than, say, handling Canada, which is very different than handling Europe, and, well, all of the countries within Europe. This was actually something that sprung up overnight, like the Taiwan Affairs system or the Hong Kong and Macau working system, where you have a central policy apparatus that goes all the way down, and even if there's interministerial competition, you find at the working level that all of these people essentially share offices, share organizations, and even if there's sort of stovepipes at the top, at the working level, everything just sort of blends together. The second major piece of this was the modernization of the Ministry of Public Security. And part of this was signaled by the Falun Gong, because they had mobilized 10 to 15,000 people in front of the leadership compound using some cell phones, faxes, I think email was also used, that there was sort of a directive of, okay, how do we deal with this? Because obviously relying on little old ladies sweeping the street at 6 in the morning is not really going to help us figure out this problem. And in line with what Sam had mentioned about crisis management preemption, there was a move toward intelligence-led policing as a way to preempt unrest. And instead of having to round up massive numbers of people, to identify the key organizers and get them before they could really do damage. If you look at the people who have been imprisoned in the last 15 years inside China, and the ones who haven't been released, if you ask around the Chinese dissident and activist communities, they will tell you that these people, like Wang Bingzhang, who was kidnapped in Vietnam in 2002 and remains in prison, that these people were the most dangerous of all of the activists because they actually knew how to organize and they knew how to move people and supplies and get people to show up and to make concerted political action. There was an effort to rebuild the informant networks and make them more relevant. We don't really have a sense of what kind of size there are. With another friend, we've dug through a lot of the public security journals, and there's no clear sense of what this is. Xinhua posted an article that was an interview with the county level public security chief, and the number of paid informants for that county was actually double the level of the Stasi in East Germany. And that was the formal payroll, not the who they report to and who's on the books as a possible source for these people. So think about it, double the level of the Stasi. The second major innovation is grid management and the Golden Shield project. For some reason, people still refer to Golden Shield as the Great Firewall and an effort to protect this information going across. But the Golden Shield project is actually a massive national level police database that reaches down to all levels of public security. And you may have read a couple of years ago, I think it's appeared in 2013, it's appeared in 2011, in sort of some of the major publications, The Economist, The New York Times, saying, look, there's this grid management thing going on in these, in this part of Beijing or out in this part of Tibet. Grid management has been applied since 2003. And its connection to the Golden Shield project is that grid management is the idea that you separate sort of grid squares off of every city, and you give individual police officers and informants responsibility for reporting on the social relationships, the sort of possible crime, the family connections, everything that's going on the street. Is there an outsider coming in? And that this was fed directly into the Golden Shield database that now made all of this information available to the center and to other jurisdictions. And what this meant was that if someone had their name put on a watch list, all of the places where you have to provide your ID, whether it's a hotel or buying train tickets or now a cell phone or online services, it would automatically register where you were going. So if you're in Ai Weiwei and you're in Shanghai and you decide to go out to Sichuan, the Sichuanese authorities are alerted to your hotel, your airfare booking, your hotel booking, and sort of where you're going to be. And it's an automatic task that's generated. And for those of us that have worked in bureaucracies, that the way to get things done is to ensure that there's a task in a box that must be checked. And so the Golden Shield project, in fact, automatically generates these tasks for local public security officers when someone on this watch list appears. And as the MPS has steadily expanded the budget and the deployment of sort of network surveillance technologies, network video surveillance that's now equipped with license plate recognition, varying attempts of quite varying quality on gait recognition and other sorts of biometrics, the more information that is fed into the system that can be used to track people and used to identify them. And it's been so successful, at least from the Chinese side, that the Ministry of Public Security has started to take back some of the roles that it had lost internally to the Ministry of State Security in the 80s and in the early 90s, and a little bit in the latest issue of Jane's. And all of this may have been fine had they created this authority. But for Zhou Yongkang's political ambitions, his connection to Bo Xilai, who very nearly caused a leadership crisis, and the fact that Zhou Yongkang had politicized the internal security apparatus, not just the Ministry of Public Security, but also the investigative side of the Ministry of State Security. At least 2 officials at senior levels have been pushed out because of a connection to him. One of them, however, survived and came back after one of the others was purged for corruption. I think because he was sort of a J. Edgar Hoover figure who knew where all the skeletons were buried. I think you know the name Qiu Jin. And again, it's not that the public security and state security apparatus hadn't been politicized before, it hadn't been involved in leadership politics and spying on leaders rather than doing its job. But in the Chinese system, it had actually been sort of tamped down quite a bit compared to other Leninist systems, certainly compared to North Korea and certainly compared to the Soviet Union. So there was a lot more push and pull in the professional ethic. And after Deng Xiaoping, there are really only 2 rumors of state security involvement, for example, in the removal of leaders, Chen Qitong in 1995 and Chen Liangyu in 2006, the Shanghai Party secretary. And because Zhou Yongkang had sort of reinserted the security apparatus into this, and it had all of this new authority, more people, more money, more resources to track people, which could obviously include leaders once they've left the compounds, making it impossible to maintain a private apartment that others didn't know about where you could have meetings, that this really became an issue. And this is the reason, not necessarily corruption, that Zhou Yongkang was on the receiving end of a significant investigation and is now in jail. We'll leave it to Sam to wrap us up.
I'd also add to that a lot of the PLA that have been taken down in the current anti-corruption campaign are actually coming from political and logistics departments. That's some people have said that probably means that it doesn't affect the operational side of the PLA, but actually, when you think about everything we're saying about crisis management, those are the most important. Politics and logistics departments are actually the most important for defending the party in this time of a crisis. It's important to stress that someone writing on the CSSC with a focus on crisis management debate within the PLA, they're not fundamentally wrong because this debate does exist. But the problem is that debate ignores the fact that the PLA is only a part of something bigger than itself. The PLA is the party's army. And for the party leadership, the objective of the party state, a key thing that it's defending when we speak of national defense, is not the state outside of the party, but the state with the CCP at the helm. As I've researched this topic, something that I've started to wonder is, should we even talk about Chinese foreign policy at all? Because when we're talking about these issues, we're actually talking about Chinese security policy. There's an external security dimension, but internal security is also completely intertwined. The perceived threats to regime security don't necessarily come from abroad, but from domestic sources of political instability, or worse yet, a combination of both, whereby domestic instability is exploited from the outside. At Tiananmen 2.0, it's possible. A war over disputes in the South China Sea is also possible. But a war that combines both, where domestic instability, major unrest, or major natural disaster or other emergency are exploited and used as a pretext for some kind of intervention. that's the biggest threat that the party's preparing for. And it's why social management and social governance contexts are crucial to understanding what state security is and what purpose the Central State Security Commission serves. Social management and social governance focus on building a dependable system of government, ensuring that the party masses, including the security forces, are serving the party leadership. That's time for questions.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, and I think it's very relevant in that context that one of the first actions of Xi Jinping when he became president was to reconvene an exercise that had last happened in 1929, to wit the Gutian Conference, at which the sole purpose of which was to remind the People's Liberation Army that they were in fact the armed wing of the Communist Party, and that was where Mao Zedong came in by telling the Red Army that that was indeed their role, and if they thought that they were just about fighting wars, then they were sadly mistaken. So this is in a sense not a new theme. So anyway, well, we've got an awful lot of detail there, an awful lot of potential points to discuss. We've got about 15 minutes, so open the floor for questions. Yes, Charles, did you know?
Yes.
Yes. Charles Paul.
I'm just going to a very brief story to show some light on this. About 2014, at a stage when we thought this commission might still have a national security role, rather like the National Security Council here, it was suggested an informal approach should be made to contact them, and I was asked to do this. And I was advised the best thing was to address a letter to the Vice Chair, what was his name, I can't remember, but an old friend of Xi Jinping's from Fujian province. So I did, and I asked our ambassador if she could deliver it. The ambassador said, all right, took it to the foreign ministry, who returned my letter 2 days later saying they'd never heard of either the person or the institution. Not treated, she decided to try the PLA. And this time the letter came back again saying, well, we've heard of them, but we've no idea where they are or what they do. So in despair, I then personally tried an old friend, the Minister for Taiwan Affairs, who said, I know the guy, but he doesn't see foreigners. So that was the end of that particular initiative. So I did get my revenge when a few months ago the Chinese ambassador here said it was very unsatisfactory. He was unable to get to see the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Nick Timothy. And I said, well, I'm very sorry, he doesn't see foreigners. But I have just two quick questions, which would be so good. And thank you very much for the very detailed and very interesting explanation. One is, how does this body relate to the National Supervision Organisation which has been set up, and which I'm told is of great significance because it's taking in also the affairs of the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, and is going to have a very wide role supervising the whole of the national bureaucracy and domestic side of government, akin to what the Central Military Commission does on the PLA side. Second question is, I heard there was a conference quite recently convened by Xi Jinping on this subject, where one of the members of the Politburo Standing Committee spoke, and the party secretary of Hubei, Jiang Shaoling, spoke on economic security and so on, which seems to suggest that there was a sort of movement to entrench this organisation and expand knowledge of its operations. Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, okay.
I think in part because they've announced so many new bodies that require so many new offices and require so much additional support that to sort of speculate on how they have come together or not come together or will function together is perhaps a little bit premature. And the first membership list that we've seen for anything related to the Central State Security Commission was just a couple of weeks ago at a meeting where they sort of announced that this included about half of the Central Military Commission, people from discipline inspection, people from states, or it didn't even say state security or necessarily public security, it said the relevant organs, propaganda and the like. So it was...
By the way, Jebbai Rocho is now mayor of Beijing.
So it's... I mean, there's a part of me that wonders that if Xi Jinping doesn't have creative political power, sort of push policies through the way he might like them, that he's very good at having negative political power, preventing others from doing something to him, and that in some ways the establishment of all of these offices, the establishment of so many broad-ranging objectives, helps prevent any kind of coalition from blocking him simply because he can move to something else.
Mm.
And I wonder if the offices are much like the policies in that respect, as a way to sort of move and dodge any sort of small factional battle group that wants to oppose him.
And just add on the meeting that you referred to a few weeks ago, the membership list was very interesting because it confirmed a lot of the things that Peter and I have been thinking. You have the director of the CSSC Logistics Department, the Political Work Department. You have other people involved, like Meng Jianju, Minister of the Politics and Law Committee, Gua Shengkun, Wang Huning, people like this, and it confirmed a lot of what what you can see if you look at local level. The local provincial levels, other versions of state security committees have been set up in the last few years at the local level, and normally the membership is something along the lines of, the military, either the military political leader or maybe a logistics commander, supervision departments, public security, and so the makeup that you see at the local levels of government is pretty similar to what seems to be the membership at the central level as well.
Right, gentlemen. Since I don't know everybody's name, before asking your question, could you give your own name and affiliation for the recording, please?
Thank you. I'm Mahmoud Ali. I'm currently affiliated to the Institute of China Studies in Kuala Lumpur. Thanks for sharing insights. There were reports after the Sichuan earthquake, I think in 2008, that Wen Jiabao, who was at home, Hu Jintao was overseas. Wen Jiabao couldn't get the military to move because he was not from the CMC, and the military determined that it would only take orders from the CMC. Is that sort of problem the State Council CMC sorted out by what you have the National Security Commission? And you talked a bit about ideology. What are the sort of elements of continuity in ideology, say between Jiang Zemin and now? How different is it? What are the new elements in ideology? Thank you.
Do you want me to take the first part?
Yeah.
Okay. So, on the first part, the issue of the CMC and the State Council has never been sorted out, and this doesn't necessarily fix that issue. Again, because Xi Jinping is the head, but at the very least, his vice chairman is the premier and the head of the National People's Congress. So that does provide sort of a state role that conceivably is a part of the decision-making process. I think it is quite possibly the first time that anybody from the state has had any kind of sort of, if the Central State Security Commission does have the power to decide policy, then this is the first time that the premier has had any real authority sort of structurally over the PLA, rather than sort of informally like a Zhou Enlai.
And in terms of ideology, I think a lot of people tend to assume that after the reform and opening up period began, that something fundamentally changed. But it didn't really. The party's tactics changed. The party's tactics for maintaining power changed. But the ideas, its ideas haven't changed. The concepts behind state security and the concepts behind social management, you can really trace back to the Mao era. It's just that the importance fluctuates over time.
Can I just question about protection of private property? That's just something by the CPC.
That's a long-winded answer. I can't really comment on the ideology side of that, but one thing that I do in my research is look at unrest in China. And one thing I've done for IHS Market is collect a database of close to 10,000 incidents of civil unrest in China over a 5-year period. And it was interesting to me that the most violent protests in China are always the small land grab protests. I think part of that has to do with resources of local officials, because normally we're talking about rural areas. Lots of times that means that the police that could come down and put down a riot are going to be using more violent tactics. But it is interesting that seemingly the most, the less visible protests are the ones that are met with the most violence, and the ones that would be solved probably fairly easily are the ones that actually the disputes behind them go on for years and years and years. There was one protest in Yunnan about 3 years ago, I believe, where villagers kidnapped local officials and set them on fire in the middle of the street over a protest that they had tried to solve the dispute through the legal system and through the proper channels that social management is supposedly supposed to take care of for, I think, 3 or 4 years before it escalated to the point where they actually committed such a violent act.
So the logic of what you're saying, Sam, is that Michael Pillsbury was right all along. Okay, next, Nicholas McLean.
Just a quick one. Some of the commissions have forms of overseas representation. I wondered if there was any sign of any representation in key areas like the embassy in Washington.
Some, you mean, of the state-owned enterprises?
Yeah. Not the SOEs. Some of the commissions that represented abroad.
No. They've all been internal, and when you look at the staffing of them, to the extent that they're most likely to name kind of the secretary or secretary general of them, and they're like Liu He of the Central State Security Commission and don't meet with foreigners. In some cases, they are pretty much all leading back to the general office of the Central Committee. Again, that's a place that you rarely have access to unless you're coming at it from the senior-most levels.
Yeah, my name is Jonathan Paris, a member of the Institute, also not like Michael Pillsbury, a more quiet former assistant writer for Andy Marshall. And on my way to Shanghai for visiting fellowship with a new think tank that Mr. Xi established in 2013. My question is, I mean, you're giving us a structural approach, which is very good. I want to apply it to a current event, which is the North Korean crisis. Samantha's last statement was something like, what China fears most is an intervention on a pretext, an intervention pretext that would undermine the internal stability. So would you saw the FT interview with President Trump. If this escalates in a way that that the U.S. somehow, quote, intervenes in North Korea, which is considered, part of China's sort of soft external territory, would that be the kind of thing that would trigger a massive fear of instability internally and therefore precipitate a very negative reaction toward the United States?
I think, as much as Taiwan might be considered an internal issue, Korea is external enough, despite the competing claims over certain parts of North Korea and the historical legacy. The 2015 Defense White Paper on China's military strategy, since you presumably remember the U.S. defense debates after the Gulf War, do we want to be able to do 2 regional wars of Iraq size? Is it 1 regional war and 2 contingencies and these variations? To really sum up what the PLA has said it should be able to do and what it's moving toward is 1 Taiwan, 1 Tiananmen. Mm-hmm. And that's really the simplest way to think about it.
No? Okay, we've got yes, sir.
No, John. My name's Adrian Cowderoy from Nexus. That was a really interesting discussion, but a very interesting exploration of the power of state security. there's always counterbalances in these things. Otherwise, the state security system would become very strong very fast, and the whole thing starts to balance. You were talking about pragmatic ones just then about Korea. There's cost influences, there's anti-corruption, which is quite significant within China at the moment. Would you like to postulate on the kind of counterbalances and how strong they might be?
Our argument is that this is the counterbalance.
Yeah.
This is that it had gotten out of control and it was politically untamable. And this creation of the Central State Security Commission is the step at bringing the policy direction and command and control of the internal security apparatus into a broader framework that includes propaganda. It includes the banks. It includes state-owned enterprises, all being at the same table and having a voice on how problems and unrest is managed inside China.
And the problem is that it might not be effective, and nobody really knows. You won't know until it's not effective. Yeah.
There will be one way to find out.
Yeah.
Okay. Any last questions? Going, gone. Right. Okay. Well, we started early, so we're absolutely bang on time in terms of having filled an hour. I'd just like to say that it's rare and all the more pleasant for that to have a presentation on China that deals with topics in such detail and such nuance. I think that's something we will need to do much more of in the future. So I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our two speakers for a very thought-provoking and interesting presentation that I suspect is going to send us all the way with lots of things to think about. Thank you very much.